They're troublemakers. They're no good. And we better be careful. We've got to take our country back, folks. We've got to take our country back. Very simple.
That was Donald Trump responding to protesters last night in Arizona. Will these have any effect on his campaign? We're going to talk about that now with Republican strategist S.E. Cupp, Dick Harpootlian, former South Carolina Democratic chair and Bernie Sanders supporter, Bakari Sellers, former South Carolina state representative and Hillary Clinton supporter, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, senior advisor to Donald Trump. Thank you all for joining us. Sarah, I'll start with you since you're on the Trump payroll. What do you think? Do you believe that he's doing enough to stop these protests?
You know, I don't think that there's anything in Donald Trump's rhetoric that is inviting or inciting violence. I want to know sometimes where the outcry is when Barack Obama was saying, let's put, the GOP is putting a gun to the Americans' heads and things like that. There was no outcry over that language. Donald Trump isn't saying let's start a riot or let's create violence. You have people that are coming in, creating a scene into a very passionate, fired up crowd and expecting no consequences. I made the kind of the comparison earlier as a Southerner with a couple of fellow Southerners here. If I went into an LSU game saying LSU Tigers are losers and expected no one to say anything to me and for there not to be any consequences, I think that would be a big mistake. And I think that we're putting all the blame on Donald Trump and not putting any of it on the protester themselves. And I think that's a big problem.
Well, I think the comparison, and I've heard those talking points from many Trump surrogates to what Barack Obama said is just intellectually disingenuous because of the simple fact that was just an analogy and none of his supporters took that seriously. But when Donald Trump is out there saying, I'm going to punch him in the face, when Donald Trump is calling Mexicans rapists, when he's insulting every single ethnic group and every person, the only group that Donald Trump hasn't insulted right now has been white men for all practical purposes. And he's gone down the list and insulted everybody. You cannot say that his rhetoric is not partially to blame for this. And I hope that Donald Trump, because he's not at a college football game, he's not with a bunch of co-eds, he's running for president of the free world. And my hope is that he elevates his rhetoric and the discourse.
Dick, I want to bring you in because you said that this reminds you of 1968.
Well, again, we had the same kinds of tensions. There was the establishment campaigns, Richard Nixon, others that were sort of disrespecting the protesters, the folks that were against the Vietnam War, that were for social justice. And it boiled over into those of us that were alive in 1968, into a major confrontation with people getting clubbed, jailed, prosecuted. Is that what's going to happen in Cleveland? I mean, is that really where this is headed? And I would disagree with the Trump folks that say they're merely expressing the disenchantment of the silent majority, perhaps. Maybe those words come back. This is what we call in the South, we grew up with this, dog whistle politics. That is, their constituency hears it, the racist, the sexist, the xenophobic, blaming other people, whether they're brown-skinned Mexicans or brown-skinned Muslims, people that aren't like us. And that's what's going on here.
I don't think it's a dog whistle. I think it's a dog scream. I don't think they're trying to. I don't think they're trying to hide it at all. And I firmly believe Donald Trump is responsible for setting the tone at his rallies. But even if you think Donald Trump isn't totally to blame or there's blame to go around, I think it's inarguable that Donald Trump is an incredibly divisive person. Whether that's his fault or the environment or the President Obama's creation, it doesn't really matter at this point. Here's where we are. And what a leader does with an angry electorate is the real test. I think Obama has met an angry electorate and dismissed a lot of the fears. He's been a little condescending. I think Trump is meeting that anger with more anger. And I don't really think that that's creating an environment to elect a leader to bring the country together. He talks about unifying. I think that's a joke.
It's absolutely not a joke. I mean, you have to look at the millions of people that are starting to vote in this process that have never participated in it before. To completely ignore that is a big mistake, and I think it's one of the reasons that he's doing so well is because the talking class and the pundits continue to ignore that fact. And I think one of the other big things that we are not paying attention to is why these people are so angry. It's because Washington has failed time and time and time again, and nobody's talking about it.
There's a difference between exciting people and unifying people.
Okay, let's talk about
exciting people, but I don't think he's bringing a lot of people together.
Let's talk about the convention, where there will be a lot of excitement, and I don't know about unifying.
Not a lot of unity.
Do you believe, I'll just start with you, Essie, do you believe that it is possible at this point for Donald Trump to clinch the nomination before the convention?
Yes, I think it's possible, and I think it's
Probable.
I think it's probable. I do. I mean, that doesn't mean that Ted Cruz and John Kasich should get out. I think John Kasich's made a compelling argument that he could be the president of Ohio, but I'm not sure where else he can go. But he should stay in, and Ted Cruz should stay in. But I think, yes, I think we're poised for Donald Trump to.
Bakari, who scares you the most on the Republican side?
Absolutely nobody. I mean, John Kasich, of course, but John Kasich literally needs to win 110% of the remaining delegates, so that's not much of a fear. I think the Republican Party literally beat their best opportunity to have the 45th president of the United States when Marco Rubio gave his concession speech. Marco Rubio and John Kasich terrified Democrats. But the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump changes the map a little bit, but he doesn't expand the base. And until Donald Trump realizes that you can't be president of the United States with simply getting white men to turn out and vote, he won't win. And Ted Cruz leaves the same playing field that Mitt Romney does, and Barack Obama won 330 electoral votes on that map. And so neither Ted Cruz nor Donald Trump, although I know that people will caution me and say, don't take Donald Trump lightly. We're not. The map is just easier with
That's
both.
what I was going to ask you.
I don't think you should take Donald Trump lightly. He's been very effective and very good at what he's done so far. And those of us that were Democrats in 1980 when that actor ran for president, and we dismissed him as, you know, the guy, bedtime for Bonzo, we all said, this guy can't be elected president. And he was.
You think you could beat Hillary Clinton?
I do. I do. And I think that she's going to have to be more agile. She's going to have to be quicker. I mean, when you talk to him or Chuck Todd or anybody talks to him, he repels the questions. He doesn't answer them. And American people aren't looking for a position paper. They're looking for punch him in the face. And that's unfortunate, but that's what's resonating right now. And Bernie Sanders is doing some of the same thing. I mean, he's a little more articulate about it, and he's not engendering violence, but he is talking about how those guys, Wall Street, pharma companies, and the federal government are not doing the job, and somebody has to come to Washington and change the culture.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you. Great discussion this morning. Appreciate it.